A janitor's daughter cracked the code that saved a billion-dollar empire, while the most feared CEO in tech watched from the shadows. 3 years, 20 elite engineers, $500 million spent, and all Axiom Dynamics had to show for it was failure, a single flaw buried deep in a labyrinth of code. The company's crown jewel, Project Chimera, was seconds away from collapse. Then, in the dead of night, a girl no one noticed stepped into the boardroom. 12-year-old Cassidy Vance, waiting for her mother to finish mopping floors, froze at the glowing whiteboard. She saw the mistake instantly, something the world's best minds had missed. 5 minutes later, she erased years of chaos with a single, elegant fix. She thought she was alone. But Alistair Blackwood, the cold, calculating billionaire CEO, had seen everything. What happened next would shake the tech world to its core. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A 12-year-old girl saw the one tiny flaw no one else could. She was only there to wait for her mother, the maid, to finish cleaning the towering glass building. But what she glimpsed on a whiteboard was about to bring the world's most powerful tech company to its knees, or save it from ruin. The silence in the boardroom was heavier than the thick, bulletproof glass that encased it. It was a silence made of failure, a suffocating blanket woven from millions of dollars in wasted resources and shattered confidence. At the head of the immense mahogany table stood Alistair Blackwood, the CEO of Axiom Dynamics. His suit was impeccable, his jaw was set like granite, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept across the faces of his top engineering team. These were the best minds money could buy, PhDs from the world's most prestigious universities. Innovators who had, until tonight, walked the gleaming halls of this building with the untouchable air of modern gods. Now, they looked like frightened children. Their expensive collars were wilted with sweat. Their gazes darted anywhere but at the towering screen behind Alistair, which displayed a chaotic scrawl of code, a garbled, useless mess. 3 years. Alistair's voice was low, yet it cut through the room like a shard of ice. 3 years, a budget of $500 million, and a team of 20 elite engineers. And this is what you've produced. He gestured to the screen. Project Chimera was supposed to be our future, an AI that could predict global market shifts with 99% accuracy. Instead, you've given me a digital madman that can't even predict tomorrow's weather. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint, desperate hum of the servers in the floors below. Holden Croft, the head of engineering, stared at his trembling hands. He was a man sculpted by privilege and arrogance, a product of Stanford and old money, who believed his position was a birthright. Tonight, for the first time in his life, that belief was crumbling. Alistair's gaze settled on him. Holden, you assured me we were on track. You personally guaranteed a breakthrough. Holden finally looked up, his face pale. Sir, the data sets are unprecedentedly complex. The variables are quantum. We're pushing the boundaries of what's theoretically possible. It was a weak excuse, and everyone in the room knew it. Alistair took a slow, deliberate step forward. The click of his leather shoes on the marble floor sounded like a judge's gavel. The boundaries, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Our primary competitor is set to launch their version in 72 hours. If they beat us to market, Axiom Dynamics doesn't just lose $500 million. We lose our reputation. We lose everything. He let that sink in, his eyes boring into each member of the team. And if that happens, he added, the steel returning to his voice, your reputations will be worth less than dust. You won't be able to get a job programming a coffee maker in this industry again. He turned without another word. The heavy door swung shut behind him with a final, damning thud, leaving the supposed geniuses to drown in the atmosphere of their own catastrophic failure. The air was thick with panic and the bitter taste of despair. Outside the boardroom's glass walls, the long, sterile hallway gleamed under the recessed lighting. It was a cathedral of modern commerce, silent and empty, save for 2 figures. Eleanor Vance pushed her cleaning cart along the polished floor. At 42, her face was kind, etched with the faint lines of worry and weariness that come from a life of quiet struggle. To the executives and engineers who sometimes rushed past her, she was invisible, just a part of the building's overnight maintenance crew. Her uniform was a cloak of anonymity. Beside her, holding a worn copy of a book on theoretical physics, was her daughter, Cassidy. At 12 years old, Cassidy was a spark of color in the monochrome world of the corporate tower. Her fiery red hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her bright green eyes missed nothing. She was here for a simple reason. Her babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and Eleanor couldn't afford to miss a shift. So Cassidy had brought her homework, finding a quiet corner in the break room while her mother worked. Eleanor paused her cart outside the boardroom. "Just this last room, sweetie, and then we can go home," she whispered, her voice warm. She glanced through the glass at the defeated postures of the men inside. She'd seen them like this more and more lately, tense, angry, and exhausted. Cassidy, however, wasn't looking at the men. Her gaze was fixed on the massive digital whiteboard, on the chaotic tangle of equations and code that had stumped them all. She had been walking past this room every night for a week, and the equation had been slowly growing, twisting itself into an ever more complex knot. Her mother started to wipe down the glass door, but Cassidy stood frozen, her brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in intense concentration. It was a look her mother knew well. It was the same expression her grandfather used to get when he was studying battlefield maps. General Thaddeus "Thunder" Vance. He had been a legend, a brilliant military strategist who saw patterns no one else could. He had passed away 2 years ago, but not before filling his granddaughter's head with logic puzzles, lessons in strategy, and one core belief. The most complex problem, Cassie, he'd say, often has the simplest solution. You just have to know how to look. He had taught her to see the world not as a series of random events, but as a system of interconnected parts. He taught her chess, code breaking, and how to find the linchpin, the one small piece that, if moved, could make the whole structure collapse or, conversely, stand strong. And looking at that screen, Cassidy saw the linchpin. It was a tiny, almost insignificant flaw, a fundamental error in the base logic of the predictive model. The team of experts, in their quest for a complex, revolutionary solution, had built a skyscraper on a cracked foundation. They were trying to solve the problem with more power, more data, more brute force. They didn't realize the problem wasn't the engine. It was the key. They were using the wrong one. "Cassie," Eleanor's voice pulled her back. "Come on, honey. Don't stare. It's not polite." Cassidy blinked, her eyes refocusing on her mother. She simply nodded, her small face unreadable. She knew better than to say anything. Who would listen to the maid's daughter? In a place like this, a place of degrees and pedigrees, she and her mother were meant to be unseen and unheard. To speak up would be to invite trouble, to risk the only job that kept a roof over their heads and food on their table. She turned and walked away with her mother, the image of the flawed equation burned into her mind. She didn't know it yet, but that fleeting glimpse was a stone tossed into a still pond. The ripples were about to spread, and soon they would grow into a tidal wave that would change her life and the fate of Axiom Dynamics forever. The small, sterile break room was their last stop. While Eleanor cleaned the coffee machine and wiped down the counters, Cassidy sat at a small table, her physics book forgotten in front of her. She couldn't shake the image of the flawed code. It was like an itch in her brain she couldn't scratch. She thought of her grandfather again. He had been so proud of her mind. "You have the gift, kiddo," he'd tell her, ruffling her red hair. "You see the whole board. Never let anyone make you feel small for it." But the world outside her grandfather's study was different. At school, her teachers were often frustrated with her. She'd solve math problems in ways they'd never seen, or ask questions about quantum mechanics that left them stammering. The other kids called her a know-it-all. She had learned, over time, to hide her light, to pretend to be average just to fit in. Being smart, she discovered, could be a lonely business. Her mother's life was a constant, painful reminder of why it was safer to stay hidden. Eleanor had once been a brilliant student herself, on a scholarship for architecture. But then Cassidy's father got sick. The medical bills piled up like mountains of snow, burying them in debt. When he passed away, Eleanor had to drop out of school and take any job she could find. She sacrificed her dreams so Cassidy could have a future. That sacrifice was a debt Cassidy felt in her bones. And it was why she remained silent. Her mother's job was fragile. A complaint from someone like Holden Croft could see her dismissed without a second thought. Eleanor finished her work and sat down opposite Cassidy, a tired but gentle smile on her face. Ready to go home, smarty pants? Cassidy nodded, but her eyes were distant. Mom, she said quietly. Those men in the big room, they looked sad. Eleanor sighed, her own exhaustion settling over her. They're under a lot of pressure, honey. When you're paid that much money, you're expected to work miracles. She looked at her daughter, at the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes, and felt a familiar pang of fear and pride. You stay away from all that, you hear? We just do our job, quiet as mice, and we go home. It's safer that way. Cassidy nodded again. Okay, Mom. But as they packed up to leave, the voice of her grandfather echoed in her mind once more. There's a difference between being humble and hiding your worth, Cassie. A soldier who sees an ambush coming has a duty to warn the others, no matter their rank. She pushed the thought away. She wasn't a soldier. She was just a 12-year-old girl. And this wasn't her battle to fight. The building was now completely still. The last of the engineers had gone home, leaving their failure behind them under the cold, artificial lights. Eleanor and Cassidy walked toward the main elevator, their footsteps the only sound in the cavernous space. But as they passed the boardroom again, Cassidy stopped. The big screen was still on, a monument to the $500 million problem. The flawed equation seemed to be calling to her, mocking the so-called geniuses who had created it. Cassie, come on, Eleanor urged gently. This time, Cassidy didn't move. An invisible force held her in place. Her heart began to beat faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. It was a war inside her, her mother's weary caution against her grandfather's resolute courage. The fear of causing trouble against the unbearable knowledge that she, and only she, knew how to fix it. This wasn't just about code anymore. It was about the injustice of it all. About her mother having to scrub floors while men like Holden Croft, arrogant and blind, drove a great company into the ground. It was about the memory of her grandfather, who believed that talent and integrity were what mattered, not titles or fancy suits. The pull was too strong. Mom, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I have to do something. Before Eleanor could react, Cassidy turned and walked toward the boardroom. The heavy glass door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside, as if crossing a threshold into another world. The room was even more intimidating from the inside. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and failure. The giant whiteboard loomed over her like a cliff face. She walked right up to it, her small frame dwarfed by the scale of the problem. Her eyes scanned the lines of code, confirming her initial diagnosis. The team was using a predictive algorithm based on chaotic iteration. It was powerful but deeply unstable. For a system meant to find order in chaos, they were using chaos to find chaos. It was, to her, an absurdly elegant mistake. Her grandfather had taught her about the ODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. She had observed the problem. She had oriented herself to the context. Now it was time to decide. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. But another feeling was stronger: resolve. She spotted a tray of digital markers on a nearby table. She picked up a red one. Her hand was shaking, but her mind was crystal clear. She reached up, her arm straining to get to the right spot on the massive board. With a few clicks, she erased a whole block of the convoluted code. Then, with the calm, steady confidence of someone who knows they are right, she began to write. She didn't replace it with something more complex. She replaced it with something simpler. A logic gate, a binary filter based on a simple, stable principle. Instead of trying to predict every possible outcome, her solution was designed to identify and discard impossible outcomes first. It wasn't about predicting the right answer. It was about eliminating all the wrong ones. A subtle but profound shift in philosophy. It took her less than 5 minutes. When she was done, the chaotic scrawl had been replaced by a clean, elegant, and devastatingly simple line of logic. She stepped back, her heart still pounding. A small, proud smile touched her lips. It was the most beautiful equation she had ever seen. She didn't know that she was not alone. At the far end of the corridor, hidden in the shadows near the executive elevators, Alistair Blackwood had been watching the entire scene unfold on the security monitor in his private lift. He had been too restless to go home, drawn back by the weight of his company's impending doom. He had watched as the little redhead girl, the maid's daughter, he now realized, had walked into the heart of his corporate crisis. He watched her study the board. He watched her pick up the marker. And he watched, in stunned, silent disbelief, as she rewrote his $500 million failure. His mind, a machine built for ruthless calculation and logic, couldn't process what he was seeing. It was impossible. It defied every rule of the world he had built. Who was this child? How could she possibly understand a problem that had stumped a team of the world's most brilliant engineers? Alistair Blackwood was not a man who believed in miracles. He believed in data, in assets, and in leverage. And as he watched Cassidy slip quietly out of the boardroom to rejoin her anxious mother, 1,000 questions flooded his mind. Was this a trick? A strange form of corporate espionage? Or had he just witnessed something that would change everything he thought he knew? His initial shock quickly hardened into a cold, calculated curiosity. This girl, this anomaly, was now the most important variable in his multi-billion-dollar empire. She was either the key to its salvation or a threat unlike any he had ever faced. And he was going to find out which. The moment Cassidy and her mother disappeared into the main elevator, Alistair strode into the boardroom. The silence was absolute. His eyes immediately locked onto the whiteboard. The red markings stood out like fresh blood against the stark white background. He moved closer, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He wasn't a programmer anymore, but he had built this company from the ground up on his own engineering genius. He still understood code better than almost anyone. He recognized the logic instantly. It was audacious. It was unorthodox. It was something no seasoned engineer, trained to think in complex, layered systems, would have ever attempted. They had been trying to build a better cannon. The girl had, in effect, invented the rifle. A faint tremor of excitement, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, ran through him. He pulled out the high-powered tablet he always carried, his fingers flying across the screen. He bypassed the main system and ran a direct microsimulation, inputting the girl's new logic. He hit execute. The progress bar filled in less than a second. A string of numbers and analytics flashed across the screen. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. He stared, frozen. Performance efficiency, plus 82.4%. Error margin, minus 94.7%. Predictive accuracy, 99.8%. He ran the simulation again. The results were the same. Stable. Perfect. It wasn't just a fix. It was a quantum leap forward. It solved the problem so completely that it made the last 3 years of work by his elite team look like a child's clumsy scribbling. A storm of emotions raged within him, astonishment, relief, and a growing, cold anger. He had paid millions to a team of celebrated experts who had led him to the brink of disaster. And their salvation had come in the form of a 12-year-old girl in a faded sweatshirt. The door to the boardroom swung open. Holden Croft stood there, his face haggard. He had clearly been summoned back by Alistair's security chief. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" Holden asked, his voice laced with apprehension. Alistair turned slowly, his face an unreadable mask of calm. "Yes, Holden. I've been reviewing your team's work on Project Chimera." He gestured to the whiteboard. "Are you absolutely certain that every possible approach has been explored? That there isn't a simpler, more elegant solution that your team somehow overlooked?" Holden scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "Sir, with all due respect, my team is the best in the world. We have explored every viable paradigm. What you see on that screen is the absolute cutting edge of AI development. If we can't solve it, no one can." Alistair's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Is that so?" he said softly. "Then please, explain to me why the janitor's 12-year-old daughter could." Holden's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter bafflement. "What? I don't understand." Alistair's voice dropped, each word a hammer blow. "A little girl with red hair stood right where you were standing less than an hour ago. She erased your team's cutting-edge work and replaced it with this." He pointed to the red markings. "I just ran the simulation, Holden. Performance is up over 80%. The project is saved." Holden's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, humiliation, and finally, a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He stared at the red code, the simple, elegant symbols that represented the complete and total demolition of his professional pride. That's impossible," he stammered. "A child? She couldn't possibly. It must be a fluke. A lucky guess. A lucky guess worth $500 million. Alistair's voice was now glacial. Be in this room tomorrow morning at 9. With your entire team. I want a full accounting of how you allowed a group of the world's most expensive engineers to be outsmarted by a little girl who was here waiting for her mother to mop the floors. Alistair walked past him, pausing at the door. And Holden, he added, without looking back. Pray she didn't damage your pride permanently. Because your career at this company is hanging by a very, very thin thread. Holden Croft stood alone in the center of the vast, silent room, the cold coffee in his hand forgotten. The red markings on the board seemed to glow with a triumphant, mocking light. This wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war. And he vowed, in that moment, that the little girl responsible for his humiliation would pay a price she couldn't possibly imagine. The next morning, the atmosphere in the boardroom was electric with tension and disbelief. Every senior engineer and executive was present, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. The story had spread through the company's upper echelons like a virus. The janitor's daughter had fixed Project Chimera. The doors opened and Alistair Blackwood entered, his expression as severe as ever. Behind him, looking small and overwhelmed, were Eleanor and Cassidy Vance. Eleanor was in her civilian clothes, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face pale with anxiety. Cassidy wore a simple dress, her red hair neatly brushed, her expression calm but watchful. She met the dozens of staring eyes without flinching. Alistair gestured for them to take seats near him at the head of the table, seats normally reserved for board members. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Holden Croft sat directly opposite them, his eyes burning with a contempt so intense it was almost a physical force. He looked at Cassidy as if she were a piece of vermin that had somehow crawled into his pristine sanctuary. Alistair wasted no time. "Good morning," he began, his voice cutting through the whispers. "I've called you all here for one reason. This is Cassidy Vance. She is the individual who solved the critical flaw in the Chimera algorithm last night. A flaw, I might add, that this team of experts either could not or would not see." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Cassidy. Holden let out a short, mocking laugh. "Sir, are we really doing this? This is absurd. We're holding a senior strategy meeting based on the lucky guess of a child." He turned his venomous gaze on Cassidy. "Tell me, Cassidy, what's your background in computational theory? Did you pick it up between cartoons and bedtime stories?" A few of Holden's loyalists snickered. Eleanor flinched as if struck and put a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. Cassidy, however, remained perfectly still. She looked directly at Holden, her green eyes clear and steady. Alistair watched, saying nothing. He knew this was a test. She had to prove she wasn't a fluke. Finally, Cassidy spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent room with surprising authority. "My grandfather was General Thaddeus Vance," she said simply. "He didn't teach me computational theory. He taught me how to think." She paused, letting the name of the legendary general hang in the air. A few of the older executives shifted in their seats, their expressions changing from skepticism to intrigue. "He taught me that you don't need a fancy degree to see something that's right in front of your face," Cassidy continued, her gaze never leaving Holden. "And the problem with your algorithm wasn't complicated. You were just looking at it the wrong way." Holden's face darkened with fury. "And what is the right way, then? Please, enlighten us." "You were building a fortune teller," Cassidy said, her voice even. "You were trying to make the machine guess the future from an infinite number of possibilities. It was too chaotic. It would never be stable." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard. With the confidence of a seasoned professor, she began to explain. "My solution doesn't guess," she said, pointing to her red markings. "It listens. It's not a fortune teller. It's a detective. It works by eliminating the impossibilities one by one until only the truth is left. It's simpler. It's more stable. And it works." She then used an analogy so simple, so perfect, that everyone in the room instantly understood. "You were all trying to build the world's most complicated ship to cross a stormy ocean," she explained. "You kept adding more engines, bigger sails, thicker walls. But you never realized the storm wasn't the problem. The problem was that your compass was broken. I didn't build a new ship. I just fixed the compass." A wave of understanding washed over the room. The engineers looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shame and dawning admiration. They had been so focused on the storm, they had completely forgotten to check their instruments. Holden Croft, however, was speechless. He had been publicly outmaneuvered, his entire foundation of expertise and authority dismantled by a 12-year-old's simple analogy. The humiliation was absolute. Alistair Blackwood finally spoke, a note of undisguised pride in his voice. "Thank you, Cassidy. That was the clearest explanation of this project I have heard in 3 years." He then turned his icy gaze back to Holden. "The floor is now open for questions. But I suspect Ms. Vance has already answered the most important one." The meeting was a rout. Cassidy answered every technical question with a clarity and insight that left the engineers astounded. By the end, the room was hers. The skepticism had turned to awe. Holden sat in stunned, seething silence. This was more than a defeat. It was an existential threat. This girl, this child, had not only shown him up, she had stolen his power. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he could not allow her to remain at Axiom Dynamics. His plan for revenge began to form, a dark and intricate web of sabotage and deceit. He would prove she was a one-hit wonder. He would crush her, and he would make sure that Alistair Blackwood, the man who had orchestrated his public shaming, would regret the day he ever listened to the Maid's genius daughter. After the meeting concluded, a stunned silence followed the departing engineers. They shuffled out of the boardroom like a defeated army, avoiding eye contact with one another, their former arrogance replaced by a humbling bewilderment. They left behind a room where the power dynamics of a billion-dollar company had been fundamentally rewritten by a 12-year-old girl. Alistair Blackwood turned to Eleanor, whose face was a canvas of pride, fear, and utter disbelief. She was still clutching her daughter's shoulder, as if to anchor both of them in reality. "Mrs. Vance," Alistair began, his voice softer than anyone in the company had ever heard it. "I believe we need to discuss your daughter's future. And yours." Eleanor stammered. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry if she overstepped. She sees things." "Overstepped?" Alistair almost smiled. "She saved this company from a catastrophe. What she did in this room was not just brilliant. It was an act of profound courage." He then looked at Cassidy, his gaze direct and serious. "Cassidy, I have a proposition for you. Project Chimera is far from finished. Your solution was the key, but now we need to build the engine around it. I want you to work with us. I want you to help us see it through." Cassidy looked at her mother, whose eyes were wide with alarm. "Work here? With these people?" The idea was terrifying. I have school," Cassidy said quietly, the first sign of her age showing through her formidable composure. "We'll work around it," Alistair said without hesitation. "You'll have a private tutor, the best in the country. You can set your own hours. I'll provide a car service for you and your mother. You will have a lab, a team, anything you need." He paused, then named a salary that made Eleanor gasp, a figure that was more than she earned in a decade. "And you, Mrs. Vance," he continued, turning back to Eleanor. "Your days of cleaning floors are over. Effective immediately, you are an executive assistant assigned to this project, with a salary to match. Your only job will be to support your daughter." It was too much. A fantasy unfolding in the cold, sterile light of the boardroom. Eleanor felt dizzy, her world tilting on its axis. Just yesterday, her biggest worry was paying the rent on time. Now, a billionaire was offering them a life she couldn't have even dreamed of. But as she looked at her daughter's calm face, she saw the quiet strength that had carried them through so much. She saw her husband's determination and her father's brilliance, all distilled into this small, extraordinary girl. Swallowing her fear, she nodded slowly. We accept." Holden Croft had lingered in the hallway, just out of sight. He heard every word. The offer of a lab, a team, the staggering salary. It was all fuel for the fire of his hatred. This wasn't a temporary consultation. Alistair was making the girl a permanent fixture, a monument to his own inadequacy. As he walked away, his mind was already a whirlwind of dark possibilities. He couldn't attack the girl's logic. It was, infuriatingly, perfect. So he would have to attack her. He would undermine her credibility, sow seeds of doubt, and create a problem so complex, so insidious, that even her supposed genius couldn't unravel it. He would make her fail, and he would make sure her failure was spectacular and public. The maid's daughter had her moment of glory. He would ensure it was her last. The next few weeks were a blur for Cassidy and Eleanor. They moved from their small, cramped apartment to a spacious suite in a luxury building, paid for by the company. A sleek black car picked them up every day. Cassidy was given a lab that looked like something out of a science fiction movie, filled with holographic displays and humming servers. At first, the engineers were wary of her. They treated her with a forced, awkward politeness. But Cassidy wasn't interested in being their boss. She was interested in the problem. She spoke their language, the language of code, logic, and data, with a fluency that quickly earned their respect, and for some, their genuine admiration. She didn't command, she collaborated. She would listen to their ideas, find the flaw or the strength in their reasoning, and gently guide them toward the solution she could already see so clearly in her mind. Alistair became a constant presence. He wasn't just a CEO, he became a mentor. He saw in Cassidy a younger version of himself, the same relentless curiosity, the same passion for solving impossible puzzles. He would spend hours with her in the lab, not directing, but observing, learning from her unique perspective. He challenged her, pushed her, and in return, she reignited a part of him that had long been dormant under the weight of corporate responsibility. He also took it upon himself to protect her. He knew the corporate world was a shark tank, and a prodigy like Cassidy was a threat to the established order. He assigned his most trusted security chief to watch over her and kept a close eye on Holden Croft, who had been reassigned to a different, less critical project, but whose resentment was a palpable force within the company. Eleanor watched the transformation with a heart full of wonder and a persistent knot of anxiety. Her daughter, who used to hide her intelligence to avoid being teased, was now leading a team of elite scientists. She was thriving, her confidence growing each day. But Eleanor also saw the dark side. She saw the jealous glances from people like Holden. She heard the whispers in the hallways. She worried about the pressure, the weight of expectation being placed on her 12-year-old shoulders. The idyllic period of progress was, however, destined to be short-lived. Holden had been patiently waiting for his moment, and he had found the perfect weapon. He knew that the Chimera system, for all its predictive power, had a blind spot. It relied on the integrity of the data it was fed. Garbage in, garbage out. Working late at night, using a series of backdoors he had built into the company's network years ago, Holden began his attack. It wasn't a virus or a direct assault. It was far more subtle, more sinister. He created a ghost. He wrote a small, parasitic piece of code that didn't steal or destroy data, but altered it in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. It was a digital poison, tasteless and slow-acting. It would change a decimal point here, transpose a number there, subtly corrupting the massive data streams that fed the Chimera AI. The first signs of trouble were small. The AI made a minor error in a stock market prediction, costing the company a few $1,000s. The engineers dismissed it as a statistical anomaly. Then, a week later, it made a larger error, predicting a commodity price surge that never happened. This time, the loss was in the low millions. A quiet unease began to ripple through the team. They ran diagnostics, checked the core logic, Cassidy's logic. It was still perfect. The system itself was sound. Yet, the errors continued to grow, becoming more frequent and more costly. The AI was becoming erratic, like a perfectly sane person being fed a constant diet of lies. Alistair called an emergency meeting. The mood was grim, a stark contrast to the triumphant atmosphere of weeks prior. The same engineers who had lauded Cassidy's genius now looked at her with renewed doubt. "What's happening?" Alistair demanded, his voice tight with concern. One of the senior engineers, a man who had always been one of Holden's closest allies, spoke up. "The core logic is unstable, sir. We warned that a simplistic model might not hold up under the strain of real-world quantum data. It was a clever trick, but it's not a sustainable solution." It was a veiled attack on Cassidy. The accusation hung in the air. Had her solution been nothing more than a temporary patch? A beginner's luck that was now failing under pressure? Cassidy said nothing. She just listened, her brow furrowed in that familiar look of intense concentration. She knew her logic was sound. The problem wasn't in the machine. It was in the information the machine was being given. The compass wasn't broken anymore, but someone was tampering with the maps. Holden, who had been invited to the meeting as an outside consultant, chose this moment to strike. He projected an image onto the main screen. It was a complex chart showing the AI's increasing error rate correlated with the complexity of the data input. As you can see, Holden said, his voice smooth and professional. The model's integrity degrades exponentially as the data load increases. It was a brilliant effort for a child, but it seems we need a more mature approach to solve this. My team has been working on a failsafe, a more robust system that can take over. He was positioning himself as the savior, the seasoned expert coming to clean up the mess left by a naive amateur. He was using their fear and their doubt to erase her victory and reclaim his power. Alistair looked at Cassidy, his expression unreadable. For the first time, a flicker of doubt entered his eyes. He had bet his company's future on this girl. Had it been a terrible mistake? Cassidy, Alistair asked, his voice quiet. Do you have an answer for this? The entire room turned to her. The weight of $500 million, of thousands of jobs, of her own and her mother's future, rested on her answer. The pressure was immense, a physical force that seemed to suck the air from the room. Eleanor, standing by the wall, held her breath. She wanted to run to her daughter, to shield her from the predatory glare of these powerful men, to take her home and back to a life where the biggest problem was unfinished homework. But Cassidy didn't shrink. She met Holden's triumphant smirk with a look of cold, analytical calm. She remembered another lesson from her grandfather. When your enemy builds a fortress, Cassie, don't attack the walls. Find the secret tunnel underneath. She walked once more to the giant screen, the digital heart of the company. She ignored Holden's charts and graphs. Instead, she brought up the raw data stream, the pure, unanalyzed flood of information that poured into the system every millisecond from global networks. To everyone else, it was an incomprehensible blizzard of numbers. To Cassidy, it was a language, and she was looking for a single, wrong letter. The model isn't unstable, she said, her eyes scanning the torrent of data. It's being lied to. Holden scoffed. Lied to? What are you talking about? That's the most secure data stream in the world. Security isn't the issue, Cassidy replied, her focus absolute. Someone isn't breaking in. They're already inside. Her fingers flew across the holographic interface. She wasn't running a diagnostic. She was hunting. She was looking for a pattern, a signature, a ghost in the machine. The engineers watched, mesmerized. She moved through layers of code with a speed and intuition that was breathtaking. Then, she stopped. On the screen, in the middle of a million lines of code, she highlighted a single, tiny string of characters. It was almost invisible, designed to look like a meaningless piece of data refuse. There, she whispered. She isolated the string and magnified it. She began to deconstruct it, unraveling its purpose with a surgeon's precision. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint click of the holographic keys. It's a parasite, she explained, her voice gaining strength. It's not a virus. It doesn't attack the system. It just feeds on the data stream. It's designed to make tiny, random alterations. It's a chaos agent. She traced its origin, following the digital breadcrumbs back through the network. The trail was masterfully hidden, routed through a dozen offshore servers, masked behind layers of encryption. But the creator had made one tiny mistake. A single, forgotten fragment of an old developer key left behind in the parasite's core code. A digital fingerprint. Cassidy cross-referenced the fragment with the company's personnel database. A single name flashed onto the screen. Holden Croft. The collective gasp in the room was sharp and sudden. Holden's face went white as a sheet. The mask of calm professionalism shattered, revealing the raw, panicked fury beneath. This is a trick, he snarled, his voice rising in desperation. She planted that. The little witch is trying to frame me. But it was too late. The evidence was absolute, displayed for everyone to see on the giant screen. The digital fingerprint was irrefutable. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own intellectual superiority, that he had never imagined a 12-year-old girl could track him through a maze he believed was impenetrable. Alistair Blackwood rose slowly from his chair. His face was a thundercloud of cold, controlled rage. He walked over to Holden, his movements deliberate and menacing. Two security guards, who had been standing discreetly by the door, moved to flank him. Holden, Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. You have committed an act of industrial sabotage against your own company. You have attempted to destroy a $500 million project. And you have tried to ruin the reputation of a child. You are a disgrace to your profession and to this company. He nodded to the guards. Escort Mr. Croft from the building. His access is revoked. His assets will be frozen pending a criminal investigation. I want him gone. Now. Holden stared, his mouth agape, his mind refusing to accept the totality of his defeat. As the guards took his arms, he shot one last, hate-filled glare at Cassidy. But she was no longer looking at him. She was looking at the screen, a small, satisfied smile on her face. She had found the secret tunnel, and the fortress had crumbled. As Holden was led away, a new feeling settled over the room. It was the quiet, profound respect that can only be earned by witnessing the impossible. Cassidy Vance, the maid's genius daughter, had not only saved the company once. She had saved it again, this time from an enemy within. Alistair walked over to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of immense pride and gratitude. General Vance would have been proud, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Cassidy looked up at him, her green eyes shining. He would have said it was my duty, she replied simply. In that moment, she was no longer just the maid's daughter. She was the protector of Axiom Dynamics, its brightest mind and its unlikely savior. And her story, the legend of the girl who could see what no one else could, was only just beginning. Eleanor came forward and wrapped her daughter in a fierce hug, tears of relief and pride streaming down her face. "Oh, my brave, brave girl," she whispered. The fear that had lived in her heart for so long was finally gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe for the incredible person her daughter had become. The crisis was over, but the consequences of that day would ripple outward, changing everything. Alistair Blackwood knew he hadn't just found a solution to a technical problem. He had found the future of his company, and he would do everything in his power to nurture and protect that future, a future embodied by a 12-year-old redhead with the mind of a legend and the heart of a hero. The world would soon know the name Cassidy Vance, and it would never be the same. The removal of Holden Croft was swift and surgical. Within the hour, his office was cleared out, his digital footprint erased from the company's servers, and a terse, company-wide memo announced his immediate termination due to a breach of corporate ethics. The whispers in the hallways, however, told the real story. The tale of his sabotage and his ultimate unmasking by the 12-year-old prodigy spread like wildfire, cementing Cassidy's status as a corporate legend before she had even finished middle school. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Chimera lab shifted dramatically. The lingering skepticism from the engineers evaporated, replaced by a profound and sometimes awkward reverence. They had witnessed her intellect firsthand, not once, but twice. She had saved their project, and in doing so, their careers. They no longer saw her as a child playing in an adult's world. They saw her as the strategic mind that had navigated them out of two separate, seemingly impossible situations. Their deference, however, created a new kind of problem. Where they had once challenged her ideas out of doubt, they now accepted them without question. She had become an oracle, and they, her devoted acolytes. It was a dynamic that made Cassidy deeply uncomfortable. Her grandfather had taught her that the best ideas are forged in the fire of debate and dissent. A team that agrees on everything is a team that isn't thinking hard enough. "You have to question me," she insisted one afternoon, standing before the team in the lab. She had just proposed a radical new way to process geopolitical data and was met with a chorus of immediate, enthusiastic agreement. "My logic might be sound, but I don't know everything. I don't have your years of experience. I need you to find the flaws. I need you to tell me when I'm wrong." Slowly, hesitantly, they began to understand. They started to see that she wasn't asking for obedience. She was asking for true collaboration. The lab's dynamic shifted again, this time into something far healthier. It became a crucible of innovation, a place where Cassidy's visionary concepts were honed and strengthened by the team's practical expertise. The project surged forward, not just meeting its deadlines, but shattering them. Project Chimera was evolving into something more powerful than even Alistair had initially envisioned. While Cassidy was navigating the complexities of leading a team of scientists, Eleanor was navigating her own strange new world. Her life had been turned upside down. She was no longer invisible. She attended high-level meetings, managed Cassidy's schedule, and acted as the fierce, protective gatekeeper to her daughter. She learned to decipher corporate jargon, to anticipate needs, and to command respect in a world that had, for her entire adult life, overlooked her. She also found a new purpose. Seeing the immense pressure on her daughter, she transformed their luxury apartment into a sanctuary, a place where the prodigy of Axiom Dynamics could simply be a 12-year-old girl. They baked cookies, watched old movies, and had long talks about everything and nothing. Eleanor became the anchor that kept Cassidy grounded, the constant, loving presence that reminded her who she was outside the gleaming walls of the corporate tower. Alistair, for his part, found himself in an unfamiliar role, that of a guardian. News of a child prodigy at a major tech firm was too big of a story to keep under wraps forever. The media began to circle, hungry for a soundbite, a picture, a glimpse of the miracle girl. Alistair built a wall of public relations and legal protection around her. He refused every interview request, shielding her from the glare of a spotlight she was not yet ready for. His mentorship deepened. He began to teach her not just about technology, but about business. He explained stock valuations, market strategies, and the intricate dance of corporate power. He was grooming her, not just to be an innovator, but a leader. He saw that her gift wasn't just in seeing patterns in code, but in seeing patterns in systems, be they technological, social, or economic. "You have a responsibility, Cassidy," he told her one evening as they stood on the observation deck of the Axiom Tower, looking out at the sprawling city below. "A gift like yours isn't just for building better products or making more money. It's for making the world a better place. The trick is figuring out how." That question became Cassidy's new focus. What was the ultimate purpose of Project Chimera? What good could it do? The answer arrived sooner than any of them expected, and from the one direction they had all been watching with apprehension. Their primary competitor, a massive conglomerate named Argenis International, finally made its move. They launched their own predictive AI, a system they called Oracle. It was a global media event, filled with slick presentations and bold promises. Argenis claimed Oracle could predict economic trends with unparalleled accuracy, and they immediately signed a multi-billion-dollar contract with a consortium of the world's largest investment banks. The news hit Axiom Dynamics like a body blow. They were still weeks away from Chimera's official launch. The market, it seemed, had already chosen a winner. Axiom's stock price dipped. The board of directors grew nervous. The pressure was suddenly back, heavier than ever. Alistair called an emergency meeting in the Chimera lab. The mood was tense. "They beat us to market," one of the executives said grimly. "We're too late." Cassidy, however, was quiet. She was standing in front of the main screen, which was displaying the live data feed from Oracle's public launch. Argenis, in their arrogance, was showcasing their system's power, letting it make a series of live, short-term market predictions. "Let them have the market," Cassidy said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "They're aiming at the wrong target." Alistair looked at her. "What do you see, Cassidy?" "Oracle is just another fortune teller," she explained, her voice ringing with the same clarity she'd had when she first explained her solution. "It's faster and more powerful than our old system, but the core philosophy is the same. It's designed to make rich people richer. It's a tool of greed." She zoomed in on a specific data set Oracle was analyzing, the complex, volatile world of currency trading. "Look," she said, "it's incredibly powerful, but its focus is narrow. It's designed to see one thing, and one thing only, profit." Then, she pulled up a different data stream on an adjacent screen. It wasn't stock prices or market trends. It was weather patterns, seismic activity reports, and agricultural data from developing nations. "Chimera can do more than predict the stock market," she said, her voice filled with a quiet passion. "It can predict a famine. It can predict a hurricane's path with enough accuracy to evacuate a city a week in advance. It can predict an earthquake by analyzing seismic tremors so small that no human could ever detect them. We've been building a tool to save money. We should be using it to save lives." The room fell silent. The engineers and executives looked at each other, a new, profound understanding dawning on them. They had been so caught up in the race against Argenis, so focused on the financial stakes, that they had failed to see the true potential of what they had created. Alistair Blackwood stared at the screen, then at the 12-year-old girl who had once again shown him the bigger picture. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had just been reminded of why he had started his company in the first place. Not just to win, but to build, to create, to change the world. "You're right, Cassidy," he said. "Absolutely right. Forget the market. Forget Argenis. We have a new mission." The next 2 weeks were the most intense in Axiom's history. The entire company mobilized behind a new vision. The marketing department scrapped their old campaign and started over. The engineers worked around the clock, refining Chimera's humanitarian applications. Cassidy was the calm center of the storm, guiding the process with her unwavering vision. Their launch event was the polar opposite of Argenis' slick, corporate presentation. They didn't rent a fancy convention hall. They held it at a university, and they invited not just investors and journalists, but scientists, leaders of nonprofit organizations, and emergency response experts from around the world. Alistair opened the presentation, but he only spoke for a few minutes. Then, he turned the stage over to Cassidy. Dressed in a simple blue dress, she stood before the packed auditorium. For a moment, she looked like what she was, a child in a world of adults. But when she began to speak, her voice was steady, her message powerful. She didn't talk about profit margins or market share. She talked about the future. She showed them, with a series of stunningly accurate simulations, how Chimera could have predicted the devastating tsunami that had struck Southeast Asia years earlier, giving coastal communities 3 full days to evacuate. She showed them how it could identify the precise conditions that would lead to a catastrophic crop failure in sub-Saharan Africa, allowing aid organizations to intervene months in advance. She showed them a world where technology was not a tool for the powerful, but a shield for the vulnerable. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, the room erupted. The applause was thunderous, a wave of emotion and excitement that washed over the stage. It wasn't the polite clapping of impressed investors. It was the roar of inspired human beings who had just been shown a better version of the future. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. The story of Axiom Dynamics and its 12-year-old visionary was no longer a piece of corporate gossip. It was the biggest news story in the world. Governments and humanitarian organizations from every corner of the globe flooded Axiom with requests for partnership. Talented engineers and scientists, inspired by the new mission, clamored to join the company. Argenis International and their Oracle system were suddenly made to look foolish. While they were busy helping hedge funds make a quick buck, Axiom was preparing to save the world. Their stock plummeted. Their banking partners grew nervous. Their victory had been rendered hollow, their powerful tool made to look like a greedy, selfish toy. In the end, it wasn't a battle of technology. It was a battle of vision. And Cassidy's vision, her simple, profound belief that the purpose of great power was to do great good, had won. Weeks later, Cassidy and her mother stood with Alistair on the same observation deck, looking out at the city lights. A new, dedicated wing of the Axiom Tower was under construction below them, the Vance Institute for Global Foresight. It was to be a nonprofit division of the company, with Cassidy as its director, dedicated to using Chimera for humanitarian purposes. "Are you ready for this?" Alistair asked her gently. "It's a heavy responsibility." Cassidy watched the distant, blinking lights, each one representing a home, a family, a life. She thought of her mother, who had sacrificed everything for her. She thought of her grandfather, who had taught her to see the whole board. And she thought of the simple, elegant line of code that had started it all. "It's not heavy," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "It's a privilege." Eleanor put her arm around her daughter, her heart swelling with a love and pride so immense it felt like it could light up the entire city. They were no longer the maid and her daughter, invisible figures in the hallways of power. They were the architects of a new, more hopeful future. They had faced down arrogance, jealousy, and greed, and they had won, not with force, but with intelligence, courage, and a simple, revolutionary idea. That the most powerful force in the universe isn't a complex algorithm or a billion-dollar corporation, but the limitless potential of a single, extraordinary human mind. And as the city twinkled below, a silent promise to a world full of possibilities, they knew their journey was far from over. It was just getting started. 1 year later, the world was a different place. The Vance Institute for Global Foresight was no longer a promising concept. It was a global nerve center for humanitarian action. Its first major public success came during the Atlantic hurricane season. Traditional meteorological models had predicted a powerful but manageable Category 3 storm would make landfall in a sparsely populated area of the Caribbean. Chimera, however, saw something else. Processing trillions of data points, oceanic temperatures, atmospheric pressure gradients, and complex jet stream interactions, the AI predicted with 99.8% certainty that the storm would undergo a rapid intensification event, transforming into a monstrous Category 5, and that a last-minute shift in a high-pressure system would steer it directly toward the densely populated coast of Florida. The warning was issued a full 5 days before landfall. It contradicted every other forecast, and many were skeptical. But Axiom's reputation, built on Cassidy's undeniable genius, carried enough weight. The governor of Florida, trusting the data, issued a mandatory evacuation order, the largest in the state's history. The skepticism vanished when, exactly as Chimera had predicted, the hurricane exploded in strength and veered north. It made landfall as a catastrophic storm, one that would have undoubtedly claimed thousands of lives. Thanks to the early warning, the coastline was empty. The property damage was immense, but the loss of life was near zero. Cassidy Vance and Project Chimera had saved thousands of people. The Miracle Girl had performed her first world-changing miracle. From her office overlooking the gleaming new institute, Cassidy, now 13, watched the news reports. She felt a profound sense of purpose, but not pride. It was, as she had told Alistair, a duty. Her team of scientists, the same men who had once doubted her, now worked with a fervent dedication, inspired by the tangible good they were putting into the world. They were no longer just engineers, they were guardians. Eleanor Vance had found her own, equally important role. She had become a global ambassador for the Institute, traveling the world to build partnerships with governments and aid organizations. The shy, weary woman who once pushed a cleaning cart through empty hallways now addressed international committees with a quiet confidence and unshakable grace. She spoke not of algorithms or data, but of people, of the lives they could save, of the responsibility that came with their incredible new power. She was the heart of the operation, just as Cassidy was its mind. Alistair Blackwood had also been transformed. The ruthless CEO, once obsessed with market domination, had found a new, more fulfilling definition of success. He still ran Axiom Dynamics with his signature efficiency, but the company's soul had changed. It was now a place driven by purpose as much as profit. He had become more than a mentor to Cassidy. He was family. He found a joy not in his company's stock price, but in the quiet moments spent with Cassidy and Eleanor, discussing a new idea or simply sharing a meal. The maid and her genius daughter had not just saved his company. They had, in many ways, saved him. The final scene of their first chapter came on a cool autumn evening. The company was celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Chimera project's relaunch. The event was held not in a stuffy boardroom, but in the soaring, light-filled atrium of the Vance Institute. It wasn't a celebration of profit, but of lives saved. Cassidy, however, had slipped away from the party. She went up to the observation deck, the place where her new life had truly begun. She looked out at the city, a vast, interconnected network of lights and lives, a system she now understood in a way no one else on Earth could. The door opened behind her. It was Alistair. He came and stood beside her, following her gaze. "It's a lot to carry on your shoulders," he said softly. "Grandfather used to say that the world rests on the shoulders of those willing to carry it," she replied, her voice no longer that of a child, but of a young woman who had seen the true weight of the world and had not flinched. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the celebration below mingling with the hum of the city. "You know," Alistair said, a note of wonder in his voice, "I spent my entire life building this empire of glass and steel, thinking that power was about control, about being the smartest person in the room. I built walls and hired experts and paid fortunes for the best minds." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile on his face. "And in the end, the key to everything, the answer I was searching for, wasn't in any of that. It was in the one person everyone else overlooked. He looked down at her, his stormy eyes filled with a deep, paternal affection. It was a 12-year-old girl with red hair, who was only here because she was waiting for her mother to finish mopping the floors. Cassidy looked up at him and smiled, a genuine, brilliant smile that lit up her face. "The most complex problem," she said, echoing the words that had guided her from the very beginning, "often has the simplest solution. You just have to know how to look." And together, the billionaire CEO and the maid's genius daughter stood and watched the city, no longer just a titan of industry and a child prodigy, but partners, family, and the guardians of a future they had built together, a future that was brighter, safer, and more hopeful for everyone. The single flaw she had seen on a whiteboard had not just saved a company, it had shown the world a better way forward. The question of what the billionaire did next had been answered. He had listened, and in doing so, he and the world had been changed forever. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.